So chapter 12, it's about the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. So in this chapter, we're going to see the major functions of the CNS, and we're going to see the different parts of the brain and the spinal cord and their functions, and we're going to see what are sensory, integrative, and motor functions of the CNS. So you saw this before. So the brain and the spinal cord forms the CNS, the central nervous system. The brain, it is protected by the skull bones. It's located inside the cranial cavity. And the spinal cord, it is protected by the vertebrae. It's located inside the vertebral cavity. So functions of the CNS is to process sensory information. So again, making sense what is going on in the environment, coordinate movement, maintain homeostasis, and then support higher cognitive functions. Well, we learn, we start thinking, we reasoning. All of those are higher cognitive functions. We develop memory. So in the brain or in the spinal cord, we have two major types of tissue. We have a tissue that's called gray matter and a tissue that's called white matter. Gray matter is called gray matter because when you stain it with certain dyes, it takes a grayish color. And white matter is called white matter because in this type of tissue you have myelinated neurons, and this myelination, these proteins, makes this tissue to look whitish. So a function of the gray matter, because that's where you have the bodies of the neurons, is to process the sensory information and initiate a motor output. So gray matter is where we have the bodies of the neurons. And then white matter, since it's going to have myelinated axons, is going to be in charge of delivering the information. So it will connect different regions of the CNS for rapid communication. So since we have only myelinated axons, you expect that the action potential in this white matter, it happens very quickly. It's like if it was a highway. So then the arrangement of the gray and white matter allows us for having efficiency, integration of the sensory information that we receive, also to coordinate the movements that we have, control our movements, and also to develop cognition and memory. So you become a thinking creature, basically. And then, since this tissue is very delicate, it has to have protective structures. So neurons, if they're not part of the PNS, they don't regenerate. So CNS neurons are very delicate, so you have to protect them. And then when it comes to tissue perfusion refers to the amount of blood that a tissue receives per gram of that tissue. The brain, it is the most active tissue in our body, so it receives more blood supply per gram than any other tissue. So you have to have a lot of vascular supply or a lot of blood supply into your brain for optimal performance. Besides having the cell bodies of the neurons, of course we have the dendrites that are connected to the cell bodies. And we can also have unmyelinated axons and synapses, the connections between the different cells. Function of gray matter, processing and integrating information. So it's making sense of what is happening and formulate a response eventually. So location of gray matter in the brain, it is located in the outer surface of our brain, which is called the cerebral cortex. Just underneath our bones, we have the gray matter. And then deep in the brain, we have nuclei that has collections of of neurons. And in the spinal cord, the gray matter is located in the central area of the spinal cord in an arrangement that looks like an H shape or that looks like a butterfly with wings open. And then the posterior region of this H matter in the spinal cord, the gray matter in the spinal cord, is specialized to receive sensory input. So we have there what is called the dorsal horns that receive sensory information. And then the ventral part of this gray matter, it is the one that is specialized to convey motor information. So these are the ventral horns or anterior horns that has neurons that controls motor output. White matter is mainly made of myelinated axons, function, transmit, action potential between the different regions of the CNS. In the brain is deep to the gray matter. In the spinal cord, it is superficial to the gray matter. Reason for that is because we have more motility in the spinal cord, so you have to protect the gray matter. And then in certain areas of the spinal cord, we not only have this anterior and posterior funiculi, which are like tracks that brings information up and down in the spinal cord, but we also have lateral funiculi that conveys information up and down. So we have tracks that goes up, this will be ascending, tracks that goes down, this will be descending. And they carry different information to different regions. We will see some examples. So here we have a frontal or coronal section of the brain at this level. So you can see the layers. So all of this part that you see here in dark color, this will be the gray matter. And internally, all this whitish portion will be the white matter. So here we have body of neurons, and then in here we have myelinated axons. And then if you make a section of the spinal cord, you can see the gray matter in the center forming like an H shape or a butterfly with the wings open. And then here we have the white matter. So we have spinal white matter, cerebral gray matter, we have cerebral gray matter and spinal gray matter.
It's like they switch.
Mm-hmm. And for the same reason that I was telling you about, I mean, we move more the spinal cord, so it's much easier for us to damage the gray matter. So which one do you think, actually, now that I think about it, I kind of told you the answer, but which one do you think is more important, white matter or gray matter? Which one is more important, gray or white matter?
Well, if you look at the spinal cord, it kind of gives it away because it's the gray matter in the middle, right? Which has to be protected.
The body of the neurons is more important than the axons. So gray matter is more important than white matter. Now, within the white matter, we have tracks that connects different areas of the brain. Like we have association fibers that connects areas within the same hemisphere. Our brain is subdivided into right and left hemisphere. So if we have some track that connects areas in the same hemisphere, either in the right or the left, that will be association fibers. And then we have fibers that crosses between the right and the left hemispheres. So this will be called commissure fibers or commissural fibers. Example, the corpus callosum. And then we have lobes within the cortex of the brain that mostly are named based on the bone where they are nearby. So we have frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, etc. And if you have tiny areas within that same lobe that connects, that will be connected by the projection fibers. Or sorry, no, never mind. Just kind of crazy enough. That will be association fibers. Never mind. But if you have long connections, for instance, between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, these will be projection fibers. So again, association fibers connect, for instance, regions within the same lobe, in the same side of the brain. So that would be association. If some axons crosses between the right and the left hemisphere, that would be commissural fibers. And if the axons connect the spinal cord to the brain, that would be the projection fibers. So here is a view of all of these. So here we have a cross section like the one that we saw before. So this will be a projection fiber because goes from the cerebral cortex into lower parts, like in the spinal cord. So these will be projection fibers. So this is called corona radiata. And then this tiny region in here is called the internal capsule. This is part of what we call the pyramidal system, the one that controls our muscles. And then we have the corpus callosum that connects the right and the left hemisphere. And then we have tiny fibers, association fibers, in the same side of the brain. And then you can see here these association fibers. They can be long, connecting the frontal to the occipital lobe. So this is the frontal lobe. Here is the parietal. Here we will have the temporal, and then this is the occipital. Or you can have shorter association fibers that connect the frontal temporal or temporal to frontal.
So as long as they're in that same area, they vary in size.
Yes, and then those will be in the same hemisphere. That's the clue. Basically connecting areas only on the left side or only on the right.
It looks like the capsule just makes it tighter, right? The internal capsule
Oh yes,
makes them tighter.
yes, and it's because you have here some centers that
Oh, that
keep
kind
them
of
tight.
squeeze them together.
yes. So then that's the transfer of action potentials then between the different regions of the brain. So, an association fiber can send signals back and forth and ultimately send this signal to the right side of the brain or the opposite side of the brain. And then these same fibers can communicate with these association fibers and the projection fibers so that you can send your command to the right area. Then you can modulate your movements. So I have this object in there, right? If I have full control of knowing the distance that it takes for me to reach that object, I will start sending signals back and forth in my brain because I have visual stimuli. And then I can extend with the appropriate distance. There are some people that may have problems and then they might start trying to attempt to grab it, and ultimately they will grab it, but they don't have that fine control. And again, this is based on visual stimuli. I know, and by experience, I know how much to reach. And then when we are babies, we still don't have that. We start myelinating our neurons, and then eventually with time we reach it. That's why babies, when they start grabbing objects like around 3 or 4 months, they just basically aimlessly reach for that object. Or even sometimes in the attempt they hit their head when they're trying to put the object into their mouth, because they're still not fully myelinated. But then, let's see, I close my eyes. It's hard, right? But still, I mean, I saw it before.
I remember where it was.
Mm-hmm. So that happens. You have to have communication. Like, okay, I have the object there. I want to grab it with my left hand or with my right hand. So then you send commands between the different regions of the brain to know what to do. And then our brain develops very early in development from some vesicles, which are dilations of the neural tube. So we have in the rostral or cephalic area of the embryo the formation of vesicles that are called primary and secondary vesicles. So from the primary vesicles, which are like subdivided into 3, we develop the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, which properly are known as prosencephalon, encephalon for head, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. And then the secondary vesicles will form the cerebrum, which is the telencephalon, the diencephalon, which will be subdivided into thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, mesencephalon, which will be the midbrain, metencephalon, which will form the pons and the cerebellum, and myencephalon, which will form the medulla oblongata. So here is the figure showing you the progress of development of the brain. So here's the early embryo, this is the late embryo, and this is the mature brain. So this part, the primary vesicle, this is the forebrain, this is the most anterior part, and then this will be the midbrain, and then the hindbrain. Out of these primary vesicles, you form the secondary vesicles. So from this forebrain, this part, you will form the telencephalon and the diencephalon. And then the midbrain itself will stay midbrain. So this will be the mesencephalon. And then out of the hindbrain, you will form the metencephalon and then the myencephalon. And then what derives from each of these secondary vesicles? So the telencephalon, which is this most anterior part, the tip basically here, you will form the cerebrum, which is all this. And then the diencephalon itself, it is the diencephalon, which is found in here, deep in the brain. And then out of this mesencephalon, or midbrain, this part, you will form the brainstem, which has 3 parts. It has the midbrain, which is this, just below the encephalon. You will form the pons, just below the midbrain, and then the medulla oblongata, which will be the lowest part of the brainstem. And then out of this metencephalon, you form the cerebellum. And then out of this myencephalon, you form the medulla oblongata, which is just below to this, to the pons. And now the pons comes also from the metencephalon. So they have a different embryological origin. So functions of the major parts of the brain. Cerebrum performs higher mental functions like reasoning and decision making. That is something that naturally it's supposed to occur with time as we age, but it is better if you train it from an early age. You don't want to do mistakes and learn by your mistakes, guys. Better learn from the mistakes of others. Don't run through the bad experience. Okay? So, decision-making ability is very important in life. And then interpret sensory information from the body. Planning and initiate voluntary movement. So we will see specific regions later on of where that happens. But yeah, that's where we plan and initiate the voluntary movements. And then the encephalon. It will process, integrate, and relay sensory and motor information. So we have centers in this region that regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, and other impulses. And we have some centers that help us to regulate the sleep-awake cycle. And then the cerebellum, it helps to coordinate the body movements to maintain equilibrium and posture. Brainstem, we have several centers there that control vital functions like breathing, blood pressure, heart rate. So we have the cardiovascular centers there, breathing centers there, and we control reflexes. And then you monitor movement and relay information between brain, spinal cord, and as well the cerebellum. So here we have a three-dimensional view of all of these areas of the brain, including parts of the diencephalon. So again, this is the cerebrum made by the telencephalon. And then here in the diencephalon, we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus acts like a filter so that you can convey only the information that it is needed. Right now is daytime. You can hear a lot of noise from the environment, and then you learn to ignore it. Because apparently, whatever I'm saying right now is more important to you than the noise from the environment. That's what it's supposed to be. If you do it or not, that's your, that's your problem. But I try to do my best to get your attention. Anyway, during nighttime, when it's time for you to go to sleep and rest, yes, you can hear some environmental noise, hopefully not as much, but you're supposed also to ignore it and fall asleep. Because if you don't do so, you will not sleep. If you pay attention so much to the noise of the fridge, or, well, if you were living in a large city, New York, and then you will be listening to those trucks that pick up the trash in the middle of the night, that would be crazy. But, I mean, you're supposed to learn to ignore certain things and pay attention and then do whatever you're supposed to do. So the thalamus helps in that. Whatever is important goes to the cerebral cortex. Whatever is not important stays here. It's a filter. It's a relay center. That's the function of that thalamus. Now in the hypothalamus, we have a lot of centers that controls many functions, including hunger, thirst, sexual drive, etc. And then this part, which is one of the control centers for the control of movement, body movement, this is the putamen and globus pallidus. And then here we have the caudate nucleus, which are part of what we call the basal nuclei. These, together with the cerebellum, help us to have smooth movements. So we have always communication between these basal nuclei, the brain, the cerebral cortex, and the cerebellum, so that you can plan and execute the movements. And then this region of the brain, which is partly physical, partly functional, is called the limbic system. So we have in the limbic system an area that's called the amygdala, where it's like the center of fear. And then we have the hippocampus, which is the center for production of memory. And then we have these cavities, the ventricles, where we produce and circulate CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So this is the lateral ventricles that communicates with the third and the fourth ventricle, and then with the spinal cord. So we will see that in a little bit detail later. So here we have a summary of all of these functions. Cerebrum performs higher mental functions, interprets sensory stimuli, plans, initiate movements. The encephalon processes, integrates, and relays information, maintain homeostasis, and regulate biological rhythms. Cerebellum monitors and coordinates movement. Brainstem maintain homeostasis, control reflexes, monitors movement, integrates, and relay information as well. So we have two relay centers, the brainstem and the thalamus in the diencephalon. So for the lobes and the surface of the cerebrum. So in the surface of the cerebral cortex, which has the neurons, the gray matter, we have different names according to the region that you are considering. So the frontal lobe, it is next to this frontal bone. Functions will be to perform motor control, plan, and also regulates our personality and speech production. So we have a specific area in the frontal lobe that is called the Broca's area that help us to move our muscles of mastication so that we can produce clear speech. For the parietal lobe, we have it posterior to the frontal on top of the temporal. This one has areas that are in charge of receiving somatic information, sensory information from your body. And then this one is in charge also of spatial awareness, so knowing where our parts of our body are. And then for temporal, which is just below the parietal and anterior to the occipital, we have centers for processing sound. So we have auditory centers there. We have centers that help us to understand language in a specific region that is called the Wernicke's area. And then we have centers for memory. Occipital lobe is just located posteriorly, and it's the area where we receive impulses to process visual information. So we have visual cortex there mainly. And then deep in between temporal and parietal lobe, we have the insula, which is a center where we process information about taste and also about reflexes, visceral reflexes. Now, within the surface of our brain, we have these neurons packed in this gyri and sulci. Gyri, it's like an elevated ridge, and then sulci, it's a shallow groove between the gyri. That increases the surface area so that we can have more neurons. And then we have fissures, which are deep grooves that separate lobes, like longitudinal fissure that separates the right and the left hemispheres. So superficial landmarks of the brain. We have longitudinal fissure that derives the right and the left hemispheres, central sulcus that separates the frontal and parietal lobe, runs vertically like this. And then we have lateral sulcus that runs horizontally, that separates temporal and frontal and parietal lobes. And then precentral gyrus will be a gyrus anterior to the central sulcus. This is where we have an area of the brain that's called the primary motor cortex. So we plan our body movements in the frontal area, and then we send a signal into this primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus so that we can execute that movement. And then posterior to this central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe, which brings sensory information from all over our body to make sense of sensory information like pain, touch, etc. So here is, I'm going to end up with these guys. So here are the different lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. Insula is deep in here. And then here we have central sulcus. This is the precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex, and this is the postcentral gyrus or primary somatosensory cortex. And then this is a view in an actual specimen. Of course, we have here the cerebellum. Top view of the brain. This is the longitudinal fissure separating left from right hemispheres. And then here, if you separate the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, you can see here the insula. Any questions? So we will leave it in there.